The stars above Threshold Station did not move. They never moved. That was the thing about stars. They just sat there, cold and distant and completely unconcerned with what happened beneath them. Commander Yeva Solano had always found that comforting. No matter what went wrong on the station, no matter how loud the arguments between dock crews got, no matter how many supply ships came in late or went out wrong, the stars just stayed where they were, quiet, patient, eternal. She was thinking about that when the sky went dark. Not all at once. It happened slowly, the way a shadow falls across the ground when a cloud rolls over the sun. Except there were no clouds in space. There were no clouds and there was no sun at this edge of the mapped sector, just the distant pinprick lights of 1,000 other systems, and the soft glow of Threshold Station's own running lights reflected off the docking arms. The shadow had edges. Yeva noticed that first. The darkness wasn't formless. It had hard lines, geometric and deliberate, and as it grew she could see the shapes embedded within it, long angular hulls the color of old iron, with surfaces so dark they seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. They moved without sound, which made sense because sound didn't travel in space. But somehow that silence felt wrong in a way it usually didn't. Usually silence in space was just physics. This silence felt like a held breath. She counted 12 of the large ones before she stopped counting. "Station control," she said into her comm, her voice very steady. "Are you seeing this?" "Seeing it," said a voice on the other end. It was Petrov, the night shift supervisor. He sounded like a man who had just set down his coffee and was now staring at something that made him wish he had more coffee. "Seeing it, and not entirely sure I believe it. Running identification now." The identification did not take long. The galactic hegemony had a specific silhouette. Every species that had ever encountered them knew it, the way every animal in a forest knows the shape of the predator that hunts there. 12 dreadnoughts, each one longer than Threshold Station was wide. 3 carrier wings fanned out behind them like the spread fingers of a very large hand, and behind those, smaller shapes, too many to count easily, arranged in patterns that spoke of long practice and absolute confidence. The hegemony had done this before. They had done it 47 times, according to the records Yeva would later read. 47 times in 3,000 years, they had arrived above a world or a station or a colony and arranged themselves in exactly this formation and waited. And 47 times, the people below had sent a message asking what the hegemony wanted, and the hegemony had told them, and those people had given it. Threshold Station did not send a message asking what the hegemony wanted. For a while, Threshold Station didn't send anything at all. Grand Admiral Vexora had 4 arms and the patience of a geological formation. She had been Grand Admiral for 200 years, which by hegemony standards was not especially long, but by most other standards was an incomprehensible stretch of time. She had overseen 6 expansions. She had accepted the surrender of 11 worlds. She had sat in command chairs on ships whose names would be spoken with fear across 3 quadrants, and she had learned, over the course of those 2 centuries, that the most powerful weapon in any fleet was not the dreadnoughts or the carrier wings, or the weapons batteries that could reduce a city to glass in 40 seconds. It was the waiting. The waiting was what broke them. The waiting was what made the species on the other side of the transmission look up at the shapes in their sky and feel the full weight of what was coming. Not the ships themselves, but the absolute certainty that the ships would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and however many days it took. She had draped her command chair in the flags of surrendered civilizations, which was a tradition among hegemony admirals. Each flag represented a world folded, a civilization reshaped to serve the hegemony's purposes. She had 12 flags. She would add a human one soon. "Transmission open," said her communications officer, a young hegemony lieutenant with 6 eyes and hands that moved across consoles with the speed of long training. "Standard Protocol 7. "Broadcast," said Vexora. "Standard Protocol 7 was a message the hegemony had refined over 3,000 years of use. It was translated, in real time, into whatever language the receiving species used. It explained, in calm and precise terms, what the hegemony was, what the hegemony required, and what would happen if the hegemony's requirements were not met. It included casualty projections. It included images of worlds that had resisted, and what those worlds had looked like afterward. It included a timeline, 48 hours, and an instruction to respond through formal diplomatic channels. It had never needed to be sent twice. The transmission went out. Vexora watched the station through the forward view screen. It was a modest structure by hegemony standards, a hub-and-spoke design, the kind of thing a young spacefaring species built when they were still figuring out how to keep people alive in a vacuum. There were civilian ships docked at 3 of the arms. There was a small defensive battery, laughably small, mounted on the far side. There were lights on in roughly 2/3 of the habitable areas, which suggested a population of perhaps 30,000, give or take. 30,000 people looking up at 12 dreadnoughts. Vexora had done this 47 times. She knew what came next. There would be a period of silence while the humans processed the message. Then there would be a frantic burst of internal communication as they argued about what to do. Then there would be a transmission, formal and frightened, asking for more time or better terms, or some kind of negotiation, and Vexora would offer them the same terms in the same words, because the terms did not change and were not negotiable, and eventually, usually within 20 hours, they would agree. The silence lasted 11 minutes. Then a transmission came back. The voice that came through the speakers on the hegemony flagship did not sound like a diplomat. It did not sound like a military commander either. It sounded like a man who had been in the middle of something else, and had been handed a comm unit, and told that someone wanted to talk to him, and had decided, on reflection, that he didn't have a lot of patience for it right now. "Yeah, hang on," said the voice. "Let me get someone who actually cares about this." Then the transmission ended. Vexora's communications lieutenant turned slowly from his console and looked at her. His 6 eyes were doing something she had never seen 6 eyes do before, which was to arrange themselves into an expression that could only be described as collectively confused. "That was," he began. "I know what it was," said Vexora. They said, "I have functional hearing, Lieutenant." He turned back to his console. She could see, from behind, that his shoulder joints were doing something slightly unusual. It took her a moment to identify it. They were trembling, not with fear, with the effort of suppressing something else entirely. She let it go. She turned back to the view screen and looked at the station and thought about the voice that had come through her speakers. Male, she thought. Or at least that was how the translation matrix had rendered it. Mid-range. Unhurried. The voice of someone who had looked up at 12 hegemony dreadnoughts, and the first thing he had done was assess whether this was someone else's problem. She had received a lot of transmissions in 200 years. She had never received that one before. The man's name was Pete. Pete Ndegwa, according to the station manifest, was a dock coordinator on Level 7 of Threshold Station. He had been working there for 11 years. His record showed no disciplinary issues, a solid performance rating, and one commendation for organizing an unusually efficient cargo transfer during a fuel shortage 2 years ago. He had a daughter named Maya who lived back on Earth, and a small plant on his desk that he had named Gerald, and a habit of eating lunch at the same time every day regardless of what was happening around him. When the hegemony's transmission had come through, Pete had been eating lunch. He had heard the translation come over the station's general comm, the hegemony's careful, precise words about what they were, and what they required, and what the consequences of non-compliance would be. And he had finished his sandwich first before picking up the comm unit that someone had pushed in his direction, because he happened to be the senior person in the docking bay at that moment. He had said what he had said. Then he had gone and found someone who actually cared about it. What Pete would tell people later, many years later, when the whole thing had become something that people wrote books about and made documentaries on, was that it hadn't been a strategy. He hadn't been trying to make a point. He had just genuinely not been the right person to handle an intergalactic ultimatum, and the most honest thing he could think to do was say so. Didn't seem useful to pretend otherwise, he would say, with a shrug that had become famous. Not my department. Sin. On the hegemony flagship, the silence after Pete's transmission stretched out for a long time. Vexora did not pace. Pacing was not something she did. She stood at the view screen, and she looked at the station and she thought. She thought about the 47 times she had done this. She thought about the moment in each of those 47 cases when the transmission had come back. Frightened, formal, desperate, and the particular quality of relief she had felt. Not personal relief, something more systemic than that. The confirmation that the universe still worked the way it was supposed to work, that power arranged itself correctly, that things fell as they were supposed to fall. She thought about Pete's voice. It had not sounded afraid. It had not sounded defiant, either, which was the other response she sometimes got. The ones who came back angry, who made speeches about freedom or dignity, or whatever their species called the thing they were about to lose. Pete had sounded like a man who had been handed a task that wasn't in his job description and was politely declining to pretend otherwise. "Admiral," said her tactical officer, "there's movement on the station." "Define movement." "Internal, not the defensive battery. That's still cold. This looks like communications activity. A lot of it. They appear to be contacting Earth." "Of course they are," said Vexora. "They're going to escalate the decision to a higher authority." "Yes, Admiral. That is what it looks like." She heard something in his voice. A hesitation. A quality she couldn't immediately classify. "What else does it look like?" she asked. The tactical officer paused. "It also looks like someone on level 7 just put in a request to the station's kitchen for an extra portion of something called biryani." Vexora turned from the view screen. She looked at her tactical officer for a long moment. "He's still eating lunch," said the communications lieutenant, very quietly, from his station. He had not turned around. His shoulders were still doing the unusual thing. Vexora turned back to the view screen. Below her, 12 dreadnoughts hung in the silence of space, weapons charged, flags flying on internal displays, the whole weight of 3,000 years of hegemony expansion, arranged in perfect tactical formation. Below them, Pete Ndegwa was eating a second helping of biryani. Somewhere in the hegemony's long institutional memory, something very small was making a sound. Vexora couldn't name it yet. She had never heard it before. It was the sound of a category shifting, of a long-held certainty developing its first hairline crack. She filed it away and waited. The stars above Threshold Station did not move. They never did. Part 2. The reckoning that didn't. Not because they were afraid. Not because they were paralyzed by the sight of 12 hegemony dreadnoughts hanging above one of their border stations. Not because anyone on Earth had looked up at the news feeds showing the hegemony's ships and felt the particular kind of hollow terror that the hegemony had spent 3,000 years perfecting. Earth took 72 hours to respond because it took them that long to agree on who should go. There were arguments. There were a lot of arguments. There were arguments in the United Earth Council chamber that lasted 6 hours straight and ended without resolution, followed by arguments in smaller rooms that lasted another 4 hours, followed by arguments over food that nobody actually ate. There were arguments about whether to send a military ship or a civilian one, about whether the response should be led by a diplomat or a soldier, about what tone to strike and what words to use, and whether the hegemony's 48-hour deadline should be taken literally or treated as a rough guideline. In the end, they called Yolanda Ferris. Yolanda Ferris was 61 years old and retired. She had been Admiral of the Second Fleet for 12 years before she retired, and before that she had spent 30 years in various roles that required her to deal with difficult situations in small rooms while remaining calm. She had negotiated 3 separate border disputes between human colonies. She had sat across the table from people who were angry and people who were desperate, and people who had convinced themselves that their cause was so righteous that normal rules of conversation didn't apply to them. She had never, in all of that, negotiated with an alien species. But she spoke hegemony formal dialect. She had learned it 11 years ago, out of what she had described at the time as idle curiosity, and what her colleagues had privately considered one of the stranger uses of retirement time they had ever heard of. She had learned it from recordings, from translated texts, from 2 hegemony scholars who communicated with her through an intermediary, because direct contact between private citizens was technically against hegemony protocol. She was, as far as anyone could find, the only human being on Earth who could speak it without a translator. They called her on a Tuesday afternoon. She was gardening. "You're going to need to do better than that introduction," she said, After the defense secretary finished explaining the situation, "You said 12 dreadnoughts. Are we counting the carrier wings separately?" They were. The full count was considerably larger. "All right," said Yolanda. "Let me get my coat." Hmm. The ship they sent was called the Meridian, which was a diplomatic vessel. It was about the size of one of the hegemony's smaller escort ships, which meant it was completely invisible against the backdrop of the hegemony fleet. It had no weapons, or rather it had no weapons that would have registered as weapons to a species that operated dreadnoughts. It had a crew of 20, most of whom were support staff, translators, and one very nervous young communications officer named Elias Park, who had been told to document everything. Yolanda Ferris sat in the forward cabin with a thermos of coffee and a pad of actual paper, on which she made notes in handwriting that nobody else on the ship could read. They docked with the Hegemony flagship 6 hours after departure from Threshold Station. The docking corridor was designed to intimidate. This was obvious from the moment the Meridian's airlock opened. The corridor was tall, much taller than it needed to be to accommodate a human being, or even a Hegemony admiral, and the walls were lined with images. Not decorative images, historical images, rendered in a style that emphasized scale and finality. Worlds, cities. The before and the after. Yolanda walked through it with her thermos in one hand and her notepad in the other, and didn't stop looking at the images the way a person looks at art they might want to buy. Elias, walking behind her, later told people that she had made a small sound at one of the images. Not distress. More like the sound a person makes when they see something they find technically impressive but aesthetically questionable. She had said, and kept walking. Grand Admiral Vexora had arranged the meeting room carefully. It was not the room the Hegemony typically used for formal negotiations. That room was designed for exactly that. Formal negotiations, with equal seating, and neutral lighting, and all the other signals of diplomatic parity. This room was the Command Council chamber. It was designed for a different kind of meeting, the kind where one party sat in elevated seats, and the other party stood and understood, viscerally, from the architecture, what their position was. Vexora sat in the highest seat with two of her senior commanders on either side, and she watched the human delegation enter. There were 3 of them: Yolanda Ferris, Elias Park, and a third person whose purpose was unclear because they didn't speak. The woman, Yolanda, walked to the center of the room, noted the lack of seating provided for the human delegation, looked around once, pulled a small folding chair from what appeared to be a bag she had brought with her, unfolded it, and sat down. She poured coffee into the thermos cap and took a drink. Vexora watched this happen. She had reviewed everything available to the Hegemony about human communication patterns, human cultural practices, and human behavioral norms in high-stress situations. She had been briefed by intelligence officers about what to expect. She had prepared, as she always prepared, for the full range of possible responses. She had not prepared for a folding chair. "Admiral Vexora," said Yolanda Ferris, in Hegemony formal dialect, and her accent was slightly odd, but her grammar was perfect. "Thank you for seeing us. I apologize for the wait. We had some disagreements at home about logistics." She paused. "Do you have any decaf? The coffee I brought is caffeinated, and I've already had a lot today." There was a silence. "We do not have," the communications officer began. "Never mind. I'll manage." Yolanda took another sip. "Should we start with your terms or mine?" "You do not have terms," said Vexora. "You have a choice between compliance and consequence." "That's a very clean framing," said Yolanda. She wrote something on her notepad. "I appreciate that. It saves time." Vexora studied her. The woman was small by human standards, from what the Hegemony records indicated about human physical dimensions. Her hair was gray. She had lines around her eyes, and at the corners of her mouth that Hegemony intelligence had told her were markers of age in humans. She sat in her folding chair with the posture of someone who had spent decades sitting in rooms where other people expected her to be uncomfortable, and had long ago stopped trying. "You have seen our projections," said Vexora, "our casualty models, the outcomes for civilizations that have refused our terms. I saw your corridor, said Yolanda. Very comprehensive. Then you understand what we are offering. I understand what you're telling me will happen if we say no. Yolanda capped her thermos. That's a little different from understanding what you're offering. What are the actual terms? Let's be specific. Vexora presented the terms. She had done this 47 times. The terms were standard. Acknowledgement of hegemony authority, integration into the tributary system, resource allocation quotas, restriction on independent military expansion, annual review by hegemony administrators. Yolanda listened. She wrote things on her notepad. She asked questions, specific, practical questions about things like the logistics of the quota system and what acknowledgement of hegemony authority meant in terms of actual governance. And the questions were smart enough that Vexora's senior commanders were answering them before they caught themselves. After 40 minutes, Yolanda looked up from her notepad. Can I ask you something personal? She said. Vexora said nothing, which Yolanda apparently took as permission. How many of the 47 species that accepted these terms are still around? She asked. I mean, in a form they would have recognized before they agreed. Still speaking their own language, running their own governments, making their own choices about what matters to them. Another silence. A different kind. They are part of the hegemony, said Vexora. Right, said Yolanda. That's what I thought. She wrote something else on her notepad. The question Vexora asked, the one she had been building toward, the one that was the true heart of the intimidation protocol, came at the end of the 3rd hour. She had deployed the full presentation by then. The hollow displays showing burning worlds, cities rendered to slag, populations reduced to numbers in a casualty report, the mathematical models showing the precise intersection between hegemony military capacity and human defensive capability, which was not favorable to the humans, the projections showing, in careful detail, what 48 hours of non-compliance would look like. Yolanda had watched all of it attentively. She had taken notes throughout. Once, she had asked Vexora to back up a projection and display it again because she wanted to note a specific number, and Vexora had done it without thinking, and then noticed that she had done it and was not sure how she felt about that. Admiral Ferris, said Vexora at the end, I ask you directly, do your people fear death? The question was designed to do something specific. It was designed to make the recipient feel the weight of what was being considered. Not the abstract idea of conflict, but the actual, specific fact of dying. It was a question that, in 47 previous encounters, had produced a visible change in the person across the table. A stillness, a recalculation, a moment where the future became suddenly, viscerally real. Yolanda Ferris thought about it. Not briefly. She actually thought about it, in the way a person thinks about a question that deserves a real answer. She looked at a point somewhere above Vexora's left shoulder for about 7 seconds. We fear bad deaths, she said. Pointless ones. Deaths that don't mean anything, that don't connect to anything, that just happen and are wasted. She looked back at Vexora. But you're giving us a reason. A clear one. Something to point at and say, that is the thing we stood up to. She paused. That's almost a gift, honestly. The room was very quiet. Vexora's senior commander said nothing. Her communications officer said nothing. Elias Park, in the corner, wrote furiously in his documentation log with the expression of a young man who understood he was watching something important happen and was not yet sure what it was. Vexora had 200 years of experience reading rooms. She had sat across from fear and desperation, and bargaining, and righteous anger, and calculated pragmatism. She had files in her memory, carefully organized, of every significant expression she had seen on every face, across every negotiating table she had ever occupied. She did not have a file for this. You are not afraid, she said. It was not quite a question. I didn't say that, said Yolanda. I said we're afraid of pointless deaths. She picked up her thermos again. You've made ours very pointed. That changes the calculation considerably. She took a sip of her coffee. Vexora looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, we will give you an extension on the deadline, 24 additional hours. She did not know why she said it. She would think about that later. The hegemony did not extend deadlines. Deadlines were part of the protocol, part of the pressure, part of the architecture of inevitability that made the whole system work. Extending the deadline was a deviation from a process that had worked 47 times without deviation. But she had said it. Yolanda Ferris nodded, folded up her chair, tucked it back in her bag, and said, in hegemony formal dialect, the traditional phrase for the end of a productive meeting. Then she walked out of the room. Behind her, Elias Park scrambled to catch up, nearly dropping his documentation log, and the third member of the delegation, the quiet one, followed without looking back. Vexora sat in her elevated seat and looked at the empty space where they had been. She had 47 flags on her command chair. For the first time in her 200-year career, she found herself wondering what the person at the other end of those surrenders had looked like, what they had said, whether any of them had brought a folding chair. She suspected not. She suspected that made a difference, and she was not yet sure what kind. What came out of the dark? They were not military ships. They never had been. The Agustina Reyes had been in service for 31 years, moving settlers and supplies between Earth and the outer colonies, on a route that had become so routine that the crew barely looked up from their work to notice the passage of the stars. The new Chongqing was newer, 9 years old, and faster, though not by much, and its cargo on the day in question was mostly agricultural equipment, some construction materials, and 4,212 people making the long journey to start their lives somewhere new. The hegemony fired on both ships simultaneously. It was precise. Vexora had made it precise. This was a demonstration, not a battle, and demonstrations required a specific kind of accuracy, enough to be undeniable, clean enough that it could not be misread as accident, calibrated so that the watching galaxy could see that the hegemony's capabilities were exactly what they had described and no more. 2 shots, 2 ships, gone. 4,212 people. The debris field took approximately 40 minutes to fully disperse. In. Yolanda Ferris was back on Threshold Station when the news came in. She was in the station commander's briefing room, going over notes from her 3 hours aboard the hegemony flagship, when the alert sounded. The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when something terrible has just become real. Not the quiet of shock, but the quiet of people rapidly rearranging the landscape of what they had thought possible. Yolanda looked at the alert. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Get me Earth," and her voice was very flat, in a way that the people in the room would remember later when they were trying to describe what that morning had felt like. Earth also went quiet. Not the whole planet. That would have been impossible, and would have suggested a uniformity that humans had never managed, even in their most unified moments. Different people reacted differently, as they always did, with grief, with rage, with the particular kind of numbed disbelief that comes when an event confirms a fear you had been telling yourself was irrational. But at the governmental level, at the level of the people who had the authority to make decisions about what happened next, there was a silence. It lasted about 3 hours. Then things started to move. Men. The hegemony's intelligence apparatus picked up the energy readings about 8 hours after the colony ships were destroyed. The readings were coming from human space, from multiple points in human space, spread across a volume of territory that was, frankly, larger than the hegemony's initial surveys had indicated. The hegemony had done a thorough survey of human territorial claims. They had mapped human shipping lanes, colony locations, military installations, resource extraction sites. They had calculated human military capacity based on those surveys, and concluded that the defensive force humans could field against a hegemony fleet was significant enough to be costly, but not significant enough to change the outcome. What the survey had not fully captured was the category of things that were not technically military, but could become military very quickly in the right circumstances. "Report," said Vexora, when the tactical officer brought her the initial data. "We're seeing mobilization across multiple systems," he said. The formal military elements are moving as expected. Their border fleets are consolidating. Standard response pattern for a species that has just received a demonstration of force. He paused. But there's additional movement that doesn't match any standard pattern in our models. Define additional. He pulled up the display. It covered an area of human space that Vexora's survey had categorized as civilian and commercial infrastructure. Mining operations, long-haul cargo routes, ships that moved resources and people and goods through the human systems on the slow cycles of economics, rather than the fast cycles of strategy. Those ships were moving. Not on their regular routes, not toward the civilian ports and commercial hubs they were registered to serve. They were moving toward the border, toward the region of space where the hegemony's fleet sat. How many? Asked Vexora. The tactical officer named a number. Vexora looked at him. Run that again, she said. He ran it again. The number was the same. N. The ships that were coming were not impressive on an individual basis. This was the thing that the hegemony's models had not accounted for, because the hegemony's models were built on assumptions about how military forces operated. Assumptions about purpose-built weapons platforms, trained crews, coordinated tactical doctrine. Assumptions that made sense in the context of 3,000 years of dealing with species that had developed warfare in ways the hegemony recognized. A mining hauler from the Kepler belt was not a warship. It had a crew of 8. It moved at speeds that a hegemony escort ship would have found insulting, and its hull plating was designed to withstand asteroid impacts rather than weapons fire. By any military metric, it was irrelevant. But it had mass drivers. All the mining ships had mass drivers. They were industrial tools, used to move ore and rock from extraction sites to processing facilities. They were extremely good at accelerating heavy objects to high velocities. The people who had designed them had not been thinking about warfare. They had been thinking about tungsten ore and silicon compounds, and the economics of getting large quantities of material from one place to another as efficiently as possible. But a mass driver is a mass driver. And there were a lot of mining ships. The agricultural transports didn't have weapons of any kind, but they were large and heavy, and moving at significant fractions of the speeds that made spacecraft relevant in combat. The generation ships, enormous vessels, some of them, that had been parked in stable orbits around human worlds for decades because they had finished their journeys and there had not yet been a new journey for them to make, were starting their engines for the first time in years, which created energy signatures that the hegemony's sensors read as something the tactical AI initially flagged as a data error. Because generation ships didn't move like that. They weren't supposed to move like that. They were supposed to be slow and ponderous and civilian, and whatever they were doing right now was not that. The AI is still calling it a data error, said the tactical officer. His voice had a quality it hadn't had before, something careful in it, deliberate, the quality of a person who was choosing each word with extra attention. But I've had 3 separate teams verify the sensors. The readings are accurate. How long until they reach us? Asked Vexora. At current speeds, the first elements in approximately 19 hours. The bulk of it. He stopped. Finish the sentence, said Vexora. The bulk of it in 31 hours. But Admiral, I need to flag something. The volume of what we're seeing. Another pause. The mass calculation. We're looking at more combined tonnage than most species field in their entire active military. Vexora said nothing. We classified them, said the tactical officer. He said it quietly. Not to her, exactly. More to the room, to the air, to the particular silence that had been gathering on the bridge of the flagship since Pete Ndegwa had answered an intergalactic ultimatum by finishing his lunch. We classified them as a species with a significant military capability, but a manageable one, within our operational parameters. We did, said Vexora. We may have made an error in classification, he said. She turned to look at him. He was staring at his displays, not at her. His hands were very still on his console. What classification? She asked, though she already knew what he was going to say. She could see it in the display in front of him, in the spreading constellation of moving ships, in the numbers that kept updating and did not get smaller. He turned to face her. We filed them under prey, he said. One. Vexora called her senior commanders to the council chamber an hour later. She laid out what they knew. The military elements, expected, manageable, within modeled parameters. The civilian elements, not expected, not in the models, not something the hegemony's 3,000 years of expansion had generated a protocol for. She showed them the tonnage calculations and the speed calculations and the projections for how the human response would look when it arrived. Then she asked for assessments. The first commander spoke about the military doctrine elements and was confident. The military ships were still within manageable range. Individual hegemony vessels outclassed individual human military ships in almost every meaningful metric. Coordinated fire from the dreadnoughts alone could neutralize the formal fleet. The second commander spoke about the civilian elements and was less confident. The numbers were concerning. The mass drivers on the mining ships, while not purpose-built weapons, would create a debris field that had to be managed. The generation ships were an unknown. The converted cargo haulers were an unknown. The third commander spoke about something different. "We've been watching the communications from Threshold Station," she said. "Not the formal channels. The informal ones. Station crew talking to each other, to their families, to friends on other stations." She put a hand on the display. "I've been trying to characterize the tone." "And?" said Vexora. The third commander was quiet for a moment. "They sound like they're preparing for something they've done before," she said. "The vocabulary is. There are words being used that the translation matrix categorizes as related to effort, to intensity, to difficulty. But the emotional register is not fear. It's the thing humans do when they are focused on a task they believe they can complete." "We've just destroyed 4,000 of their people," said Vexora. "Yes," said the third commander, "and they're angry. The anger is there, but it's organized." She paused, searching for the right translation. "It's purposeful. They've taken the grief, and they've put it somewhere they can use it." The council chamber was very quiet. Vexora thought about that. She thought about the 47 flags on her command chair, about 47 civilizations that had looked at 12 dreadnoughts, and made the same calculation, and reached the same conclusion. She thought about the quality of fear she had seen in 47 different sets of eyes, across 47 different negotiating tables. She thought about Yolanda Ferris in her folding chair, drinking coffee she hadn't needed to bring because she had decided, before the meeting even started, that she was going to be comfortable. "We may have miscalculated," she said. No one disagreed. On Threshold Station, Pete Ndegwa was still working his shift. He was coordinating the docking schedules for the ships coming in from the inner systems. Not military ships, not yet. Just the first wave of the civilian mobilization, the ones close enough to arrive early. He was doing this with the focused, methodical attention he brought to every docking problem, rerouting traffic, reassigning berths, making the calculations for fuel and clearance and timing that kept a busy station from becoming a chaotic one. His supervisor had asked him if he wanted to go home. A lot of the non-essential crew were being offered the option. Pete had said he'd finish his shift first. There was a lot of traffic to coordinate. The ships kept coming. Out of the dark, out of the places between the stars. Small ships and large ones, slow and fast, crewed by people who had gotten a message and made a calculation that the hegemony would not have recognized as a military calculation because it wasn't one. It was something older than that. Something the hegemony's 3,000 years of careful expansion had never had to name, because they had never encountered it at full scale before. Pete logged another docking request, made the adjustments, moved on to the next one. The ships kept coming. Part 4. The joke they didn't get. The hegemony's tactical doctrine called for an opening salvo from the primary weapons batteries. A coordinated strike designed to eliminate the highest threat elements of the opposing force in the first moments of engagement. This was standard. This was what the hegemony had done in every military engagement for 300 years, and it worked because it was decisive, and because decisiveness, in battle as in politics, communicated something that mere capability could not. It said, "We have thought about this longer than you have. We have done this more times than you have. We know exactly what happens next." The salvo landed. It was accurate. Several human military ships took direct hits and were disabled or destroyed in the first exchange. The hegemony's tactical display, updated with kill confirmations, green indicators spreading across the map of the engagement space, and Vexora stood at her command station and watched it and felt the familiar, clean machinery of the opening of a battle doing what it was supposed to do. Then the human ships did something the tactical display had no category for. Captain Dara Okonkwo of the cruiser INS Adamachine had been in the Second Fleet for 14 years. She had served in 2 border conflicts between human colonies, which were the kinds of conflicts that involved a lot of careful maneuvering and formal ultimatums, and occasionally some actual shooting. And she had come out of them with a practical, unglamorous understanding of what combat felt like from inside a ship that was being shot at. It felt, she had once told a junior officer, like being inside a metal box that someone very large was trying to dent, and your job was to make the box move in ways that made denting difficult. The hegemony's opening salvo had dented several boxes. The adamantine was not one of them, not because of any particular skill on Dara's part, but because of a navigational choice she had made 40 minutes before the shooting started, when she had looked at the hegemony's formation and thought about where the fire was most likely to go, and moved her ship to a place that was slightly inconvenient, but significantly less likely to be on fire. She had learned this from her grandmother, who had grown up in a city that got flooded every other year, and had developed a very practical approach to anticipating where the water would go. The hegemony did not know about Dara's grandmother. Their tactical models accounted for human military doctrine. They had studied human combat records, analyzed human tactical patterns, modeled human response times and decision cycles. They had a very thorough picture of how human military ships were supposed to behave in the opening seconds of an engagement. The adamantine was not behaving that way. Neither, Dara noticed as she checked the fleet display, were several other ships whose captains she knew personally, which suggested that the deviation from expected behavior was not accidental. It was the kind of thing that happens when a lot of people who have spent their careers thinking about the same problem reach similar conclusions from different directions. "Bring us around to bearing 270, she said, and open fleet comm. The fleet channel crackled open. It was, technically, an open tactical channel, the kind that should have been tightly controlled, short transmissions only, information dense and time critical. What it actually sounded like, in the first 30 seconds of the engagement, was approximately what you would get if you put 20 people who knew each other well in a room with a complex problem and asked them to solve it together. Okonkwo, are you seeing their fire pattern? Seeing it. They're leading high. Compensating. Got the Arjuna on my port. She's in trouble. Can anyone? Already on it. Already on it. Their carrier wings are splitting. The doctrine says they split when they're... Yeah, I know what it says. I'm looking at it. It says what everyone thought it said. Tsukamoto, did you just do what I think you did? Technically, it counts for the bet. No, it doesn't. You said before the engagement started. I said the maneuver. I didn't say when. Fleet. Focus, said Dara, without particular urgency. She pulled the adamantine hard to starboard as a burst of fire passed where they had been. Someone want to tell me what the mining group is doing on the right flank? Mining group is... They're doing something creative with momentum, I'll say that. Creative how? Remember that game where you use a slingshot to hit things around corners? It's like that, but with several thousand tons of ore hauler. A brief pause. I love these people, said someone whose call sign Dara didn't immediately recognize. Focus, she said again, still without urgency. Tsukamoto, about that maneuver. I'm putting credits in the pot now, Okonkwo. Let it go. On the Hegemony flagship, the tactical display was showing things it had not been designed to show. The formal military engagement, the part that matched the models, was proceeding as predicted on those specific vectors where it was happening. But the engagement space had expanded well beyond those vectors. The human military ships were not holding position the way the models said they would. They were moving, constantly, in patterns that were individually legible, but collectively strange, not random, not chaotic, but not organized in any way the hegemony's tactical doctrine recognized as organized. And the civilian ships were in the engagement space. This was the part that was making the tactical display confused. The mining haulers had done what the fleet channel had called something creative with momentum, and what the hegemony's tactical AI was labeling anomalous object trajectories, and flagging for human review, because its models could not determine whether they were intended or accidental. The answer was that they were intended, and the intentions had been calculated by people who spent their working lives thinking about how to move very large objects through space without hitting other things, and who had, on short notice, applied that expertise to the slightly different problem of how to move very large objects through space and hit specific other things. The generation ships had not attacked. They were too slow for that. What they had done was move to positions that complicated the hegemony's options in ways the tactical AI was still trying to quantify, occupying space that the hegemony had intended to use, and forcing adjustments that cascaded through the tactical picture in ways that took time and attention to manage. Their formal military elements are adapting faster than predicted, said the tactical officer. His voice was professional, controlled. He was a professional, and he was controlling himself with the care of a person who understood that the moment to panic was not now. Response times on their maneuvering are, he checked the display, faster than the models. By how much? Asked Vexora. Significantly. He paused. Admiral, I'm watching their fleet coordination. The channel discipline is. Report. They're talking to each other, he said. During the engagement. Not short command bursts. Conversations. And there's laughter. Vexora turned from the display she had been studying. There's what? The translation matrix is flagging audio elements in their fleet channel that it categorizes as laughter. Multiple instances. It is flagging them as possible translation error, but I've had 2 separate officers confirm the audio patterns. He turned to face her. They are laughing, Admiral, during the battle. Fane. Vexora had commanded fleets for 200 years. In 200 years of fleet command, she had heard a great many things on enemy communication channels. She had heard fear, the thin, high-register sounds that different species made when the mathematics of their situation became undeniable. She had heard rage, the hot and disordered thing that came when a species decided that going down fighting was preferable to not going down at all. She had heard desperation and bargaining, and the kind of fierce, wordless focus that came when people who were well-trained pushed themselves past the limits of their training. She had never heard laughter. Laughter was not a combat sound. Laughter was the sound of something being funny, and there was nothing funny about the inside of a battle. Battle was consequence. Battle was the place where the mathematics of force became visible and undeniable and personal. There was no laughter in the arithmetic of destruction. Play it, she said. The communications officer played a segment of the human fleet channel. The translation matrix worked in real time, and Vexora listened to the words, and also to what was beneath the words, the quality of the sound, the tone, the register, the argument about whether a maneuver counted for a bet, the sound of a human voice saying, I love these people, about people they were fighting alongside. The laughter. It was not the laughter of people who didn't understand what was happening. It was not the laughter of people who were pretending to be unafraid. It was not performed. It was the laughter of people who were paying full attention, who were good at what they were doing, and who found something genuinely absurd about the situation they were in, not in a way that made them less serious about it, but in a way that made the seriousness more livable. Vexora had read a great deal about human history in the 72 hours while they had been waiting for Earth to respond to Protocol 7. She had read it because she was thorough, and because she had learned over 200 years that understanding an opponent thoroughly was more useful than underestimating them. She had read about humans in confined spaces, under sustained pressure, in circumstances that would have broken most species. She had read about the specific, strange coping mechanism they seemed to have developed. Not the ability to avoid fear, but the ability to exist alongside it without being consumed by it. The ability to find the absurdity in the serious, and the seriousness in the absurd, and hold both at the same time. She had read it and categorized it as interesting cultural information. She was reclassifying it now. Um, um. Aboard the INS Adamantine, the battle was going better than Dara had hoped, and worse than she had wanted. Better because they were still here. They were still maneuvering, still in the fight, still making the hegemony's tactical picture complicated in ways that would cost the hegemony time and attention and resources. The civilian ships were doing things that nobody had briefed her on because nobody had planned them in advance. They were improvising, and the improvisation was working. And watching a generation ship position itself like an enormous, unmovable obstacle in the middle of the hegemony's firing line was one of the stranger things Dara had seen in 14 years of service. Worse because they were losing ships. Not many, by the brutal mathematics of what they were facing. But each loss was someone she might know. Someone's grandmother's granddaughter. Someone who had looked at the same mobilization message everyone else had looked at, and made the same calculation. Fleet, she said, on the open channel. Status. The answers came back fast, overlapping. The voices of people she had worked with and fought alongside, and occasionally argued with in the kinds of arguments that only happen between people who respect each other enough to disagree. They were holding. Vexora called a halt after 4 hours. This was not a thing that was done. There was no protocol for calling a halt in the middle of a military engagement that was, by the tactical models, proceeding within acceptable parameters. The models said the hegemony was achieving its objectives. The models said the human force, while performing above initial projections, was within the range of manageable resistance. But Vexora was looking at her tactical display and also at something the models couldn't show her. The human fleet channel, which was still running, which she had been listening to for 4 hours. They had been laughing for 4 hours. Not constantly, not in the moments of genuine crisis, but in the spaces between the crisis moments, the moments where training took over, and the immediate danger was managed, and there was half a second to exist as something other than a person in a battle. They were there, talking to each other, finding the absurd, holding the seriousness and the absurdity in the same hands. She thought about the 47 flags. She thought about the species that had surrendered, and the quality of what she had read in them. The fear, yes, but more than fear. A particular kind of resignation. The look of people who had looked at the ships above them and performed a calculation and understood, correctly, that the result of the calculation was not in their favor. She thought about humans performing the same calculation and laughing. All units, she said, cease fire, hold position. The bridge was very still. Admiral, said the tactical officer carefully, we are within. I know what we're within, she said. Cease fire. The order went out. Across the engagement space, the hegemony's weapons went quiet. On the human fleet channel, which Vexora was still monitoring, there was a moment of surprised silence. Then voices, rapid and questioning, asking what was happening. Then someone, she couldn't identify who, said, "Did they just stop?" And someone else said, "Looks like." And then, Tsukamoto, "You absolutely owe me." And then, unmistakably, laughter. Vexora had commanded fleets for 200 years. She had never stopped a battle in the middle of it. She had never had a reason to. She had never, in 200 years, fought something that laughed. She stood at her command station and listened to the sound of it coming through the speakers, and she thought about the folding chair, and Pete Ndegwa eating his second helping of lunch, and Yolanda Ferris asking if they had decaf. The calculation she was running now was different from the tactical models. The tactical models said she was winning. The calculation she was running now said she was winning a battle and losing something she couldn't yet name, against a species whose relationship with danger was not what she had thought it was, and that continuing in the direction she had been going would produce an outcome that the flags on her command chair had not prepared her to understand. For the first time in 3,000 years of hegemony expansion, somebody called a halt. The stars above the engagement space did not care. They never did. But in 17 watching civilizations, in the tributaries and client states and surrendered peoples who had tuned in to monitor the expected outcome of the hegemony's latest expansion, the question that had been trying to form for a long time finally finished forming. It was a simple question. It was the most dangerous question possible. It was, what if we had done that? Comma, comma, comma. Part 5. The laughter was the point. The hegemony's fleet held its position above and around Threshold Station like a question that hadn't been answered yet. The human ships, the military ones and the civilian ones and the generation ships, and the mining haulers and the agricultural transports, held theirs, a rough and improvised perimeter that had no name in any military doctrine, but that everyone on both sides understood meant the same thing. We are still here. During those 11 days, a lot of things happened on the diplomatic channels. There were formal communications exchanged through official protocol. There were informal communications that were technically unauthorized, and that both sides pretended not to be having. There were discussions about terms and counterterms, and what the shape of any agreement might look like. And those discussions were the kind of discussions that take a long time, because both parties are trying to figure out what they actually want. And figuring out what you actually want is harder than it sounds, when you started the conversation expecting something completely different. On the 12th day, the Meridian docked again with the Hegemony flagship. Yolanda Ferris brought her folding chair. None. The meeting room was different this time. Not the command council chamber with its elevated seats and its architecture of dominance. A different room, smaller, more neutral, with seats at an actual table instead of hierarchical positions arranged to communicate who held the power. Vexora had not announced this change. She had simply had the room prepared differently and had not explained why. Yolanda had noticed. She had unfolded her chair anyway, set it at the table, and sat in it rather than the room's provided seating, which was a statement of continuity that Vexora had decided not to interrogate. The negotiations over the 3 days that followed were, in many ways, less dramatic than the first meeting. The terms they arrived at were not what the hegemony had originally demanded. They were something more complicated, a framework for formal relations, trade agreements, defined boundaries, protocols for future contact. Not tribute, not integration into the tributary system, something more like two parties who have had an unexpected fight and are now sitting across a table from each other trying to work out what to do with the information that produced. Vexora's legal advisors were unhappy with the terms. They were not what the hegemony had come for. They were not what 3,000 years of expansion had built a framework to produce. She accepted them anyway, not because she had lost. The tactical models still said the hegemony could win a sustained conflict with humanity, though the confidence intervals on those models had widened considerably over the past 11 days. Not because she was afraid. Fear was not something Vexora had a great deal of experience with, in herself. She accepted them because of something that had been accumulating since the moment Pete Ndegwa had told the hegemony's flagship to hang on. He was going to find someone who cared. Something that had built through the folding chair and the decaf question, and the casualty projections that Yolanda Ferris had watched with the same expression, most people reserved for moderately interesting lectures. Something that had crystallized, 4 hours into a battle, when she had been listening to the human fleet channel and heard laughter. She accepted the terms because she had been in the business of expansion for 200 years, and she had learned, in 200 years, to recognize when you had discovered something new, something that was going to matter, something that the old frameworks were not built to contain. Chui. On the last day of negotiations, when the formal documents had been drafted and reviewed, and were waiting for final signatures, Vexora did something she had never done in 47 previous encounters. She asked a personal question. "Admiral Ferris," she said, when the official business was finished and Elias Park had stepped out to transmit the preliminary documents, and the room was as close to private as it was going to get. "I have a question that is not part of the formal negotiation." Yolanda had been pouring the last of her thermos. She looked up. "Go ahead. What were you laughing at?" The question hung in the air between them. Vexora had been building toward it for 11 days. It was the question that none of her briefings, none of her models, none of her 200 years of experience had equipped her to answer. The battle footage showed it clearly. The Fleet Channel recordings confirmed it. During 4 hours of active combat against the largest military force humanity had ever faced, the human ships had been laughing. It was not a tactic. She had considered that. She had had her analysts examine it for signs of calculated psychological warfare, for evidence that it was performed for effect. It was not. It was real. She wanted to understand it. Yolanda thought about the question. Not quickly. She thought about it in the way she thought about things that deserved real consideration, which meant she looked somewhere above Vexora's shoulder for several seconds, and arrived at her answer from the inside, rather than pulling it off a shelf. The absurdity of it, she said. You came with 12 dreadnoughts to frighten people who'd been frightening themselves for 10,000 years. You showed up with the biggest stick anyone had ever seen, aimed at a species that invented the concept of using sticks in the first place. She took a sip. And the thing is, you didn't know us. You had a file on us. You'd looked at our ships and counted our weapons and run your calculations, and you came up here and you did the thing that works on everyone, and it just didn't. She paused. There's something funny in that. Not cruel funny. Just the gap between what you expected and what you got. The gap was very large. Gaps that large are funny. Vexora was quiet for a moment. We have expanded for 3,000 years, she said. 47 times. No species has ever. I know, said Yolanda. That's the other funny part. You came to perform something at people who don't particularly like theater. She set the thermos down. We're not a very theatrical species. We have our moments, but mostly we want to know what's actually happening and deal with that. The performance kind of bounced off. The performance bounced off, Vexora repeated slowly. The dreadnoughts were real, said Yolanda, and her voice was serious for a moment. The ships you destroyed were real. The people on them were real. That part didn't bounce off. That part is going to be with us for a long time. The room was quiet. But the intimidation part, she continued. The standing there, looking large and powerful and inevitable, that part didn't work. Because we've seen large and powerful and inevitable. We've done large and powerful and inevitable to each other for a very long time. It's not unfamiliar. She looked at Vexora directly. You needed us to not have a category for you, and we already did. Vec! Aura! Vexora was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that the silence became its own kind of conversation, the kind where both parties are sitting with something that is taking up more space than expected, and neither one is quite ready to be done with it yet. How do I learn what you are? She said at last. It was not a question she had ever asked before. In 47 expansions, in 200 years of fleet command, in 3,000 years of hegemony institutional history, it was not a question that had come up, because the question assumed something that the hegemony had never had reason to assume, that a species they had encountered might have something to teach them that they didn't already know. Yolanda looked at her. She looked at her in a way that Vexora had to categorize as careful, not guarded, not suspicious, but attentive, in the way that people are attentive when they're deciding whether something is real. Show up, said Yolanda Ferris. Unarmed. We'll cook something. Then, the signing of the formal agreement took place on Threshold Station. This was Yolanda's suggestion, and it was accepted after only brief discussion. Threshold Station was neutral ground in a way that neither flagship could be, and also it was where Pete and Degwa worked, which Yolanda had mentioned without further explanation, and which Vexora had accepted without asking for one. Pete and Degwa was not at the signing. He was working. He had a docking schedule to maintain, and the traffic through Threshold Station had increased considerably over the past 2 weeks, and there was no one else who knew the bay assignments the way he did. His daughter Maya watched the signing on a screen somewhere back on Earth. She was 8 years old, and she had been following the whole thing, with the focused attention of a child who doesn't fully understand the details, but understands completely that something important is happening. Her father had told her, in their last call, not to worry. Is it scary? She had asked. A little, he had said. Most things worth doing are a little scary. Are you scared? I finished my lunch, he had said, which was not an answer, and which Maya had understood, somehow, as more reassuring than an answer would have been. Anne. Vexora watched the signing on the screens of her flagship. She did not attend in person. That would come later. The showing up, the unarmed visit, the food that she had been promised. Those things would require time and preparation, and the kind of careful institutional rearrangement that 200-year-old habits required. But she watched. She watched Yolanda sign the documents with the same practical, unhurried attention she brought to everything. She watched the hegemony's diplomatic representative sign with the elaborate formal flourishes that hegemony protocol required. She watched the small group of humans and hegemony staff in the room with them, standing at the edges, watching the thing happen. She looked at the flags on her command chair. 47 of them. She had spent 2 weeks thinking about the question Yolanda had answered in the negotiating room, the question about the species they had been before the hegemony arrived, whether any of them would have recognized themselves afterward, the question she hadn't asked, the one she had asked instead, and what Yolanda had said. She thought about Pete Ndegwa finishing his lunch. She thought about the human fleet channel, and the laughter, and the argument about a bet, and I love these people, said by someone about the people they were fighting alongside during a battle. She thought about 3,000 years of expansion and 47 flags, and the assumption, never examined, never questioned, that the correct relationship between the hegemony and the things they encountered was the relationship they had always had. She did not take the flags down. That would have been theater, and she was a practical person. But she looked at them differently now. Across 17 civilizations, in the client states and tributaries and surrendered peoples who had been watching, some openly, some through channels they weren't supposed to have, something was changing. Not quickly. These things don't happen quickly. The hegemony was old and patient and very large, and the political structures it had built over 3,000 years were not going to shift because of one agreement with one species at one border station. The client states would continue to be client states. The tributaries would continue to pay their tribute. The systems that ran things would continue to run them. But the question that had formed during the battle, the simple, dangerous question, what if we had done that, was in the air now. It had been thought. And thoughts, once thought, are very difficult to unthink. In small rooms, in quiet conversations, in the kind of exchanges that don't get recorded because no one with the authority to record them knows they're happening, that question was being asked. Not loudly. Not yet. Not in ways that were actionable or organized, or that the hegemony's intelligence apparatus had a category for, but asked. When? On Threshold Station, Pete Ndegwa finished his shift at 6 o'clock. He logged the last docking request, updated the bay assignments for the overnight crew, and made sure that Gerald, his desk plant, had been watered. Gerald had been a little droopy lately, which Pete suspected was a function of the artificial lighting in the bay office rather than anything Pete had done wrong, but he watered him anyway because hope was a reasonable response to droopy plants. He put on his jacket. He had a message from his daughter Maya on his comm unit, a short one, the kind an 8-year-old sends when she has something to say but isn't sure how to say the whole thing. It said, "Dad, were you actually scared?" He wrote back, "A little. But you know what's funny? Not even that much." She sent back a question mark. He thought about how to explain it. He thought about 12 dreadnoughts in the sky, and the weight of the transmission that had come through, and the moment when someone had pushed a comm unit in his direction, and he had looked at it, and made the assessment that this was not his department. He thought about the fact that his first instinct had not been fear, that fear had come, in its own time, later, when he had had a moment to sit with what was happening, but his first instinct, the gut-level, unexamined, automatic thing, had been a kind of mild irritation that whoever was calling had picked such an inconvenient time. He had been eating lunch, he wrote back, because they didn't know us, and when you don't know someone, you fill in what you expect. They expected something different. The gap between what they expected and what they got, that gap was so big it kind of became funny. 3 dots appeared as Maya typed. Then, "Did you explain that to them?" He smiled. "A little," he wrote. "Someone else mostly did that part. Someone better at explaining than me." He put his comm unit in his pocket and walked out of the bay office and down the corridor toward the station's common area, where he was fairly confident that someone, somewhere, had started cooking something. There had been a lot of people on Threshold Station lately. When there are a lot of people in a small space, someone always starts cooking something. The stars outside the station's windows were exactly where they had always been. They always were. Quiet and patient and completely unconcerned with what happened beneath them, the way stars have always been and will always be, indifferent to the small and temporary things that move through the spaces between them, the ships and the flags and the 200-year careers, and the 3,000-year expansions and the agreements signed in small rooms, and the questions forming in 17 civilizations, and the laughter in the middle of battles and the conversations between fathers and daughters about whether a thing was scary, and what it meant that it wasn't as scary as it might have been. The stars did not care. But Pete and Degwa walked toward the smell of food and the sound of voices, and somewhere on the flagship of the Grand Admiral of the Galactic Hegemony, Vex-Ora was looking at 47 flags and thinking about a question she had asked, and the answer she had received, and in 17 other places the most dangerous thought in the known galaxy was being quietly thought for the very first time. The universe was the same size it had always been. It just felt, somehow, a little different than it had 11 days ago.